True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Karla Brown was 22 years old back in 1978. After 5 years of an off-and-on relationship, she and her fiancé Mark bought their first home together. So that June, the couple were really focused on moving and decorating their new home. They had some friends over to help with the move on June 20th, followed by an evening of food and drinks. Next door at the home of Paul Main, the pretty and outgoing Karla had not gone unnoticed as she carried boxes into her home. Join us at the quiet end for Finding Karla Brown's Killer. Karla's fiancé Mark went to work on June 21st, leaving Karla home alone. Between 10 and 11 a.m., Karla ended a phone call with her future mother-in-law, telling her that someone was at the door. By the time Mark returned home that day, Karla would be the victim of a brutal murder, and she would become the focus of a lengthy and complex investigation. So this happened in Illinois, Dickie.
So since it's Illinois, I've got to choose a beer from one of my favorite brewing companies, Goose Island in Chicago. And they make a stout called Bourbon County brand stout, and they have a bunch of varieties of it. So this is Bourbon County brand 14 stout. Now it's a big heavy hitter. It's 13.5% alcohol by volume, so we will sip and share. It's a dark brown beer, maybe some hints of mahogany in it. Small tan head, nice aroma of roasted malt, some chocolate and coffee, and the taste was a nice balance of milk chocolate and strong coffee. Very nice beer, very easy to drink. You don't even notice the alcohol, so again, you best be careful with this one.
I can be careful if you could be careful. Can you be careful?
I'm always careful.
All right, then why don't you carefully open it up?
Will do.
Oh, the smell is fabulous.
You like that?
I do. Very rich, very chocolatey.
Yeah, it's a nice beer.
Yeah. So this case was recommended by Judy P. Thanks, Judy. And I just want to say before we get started, as we tell the story, we've used some of the pseudonyms from the book Silent Witness by Don Weber and Charles Bosworth for a couple of the neighbors, just people who aren't really important to the case. All right?
Okay.
All right.
Let's go.
Let's talk about it.
So Karla Brown's immediate family began when her mother, Jo Ellen, met her father, Floyd Brown, in a bar in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. 18-year-old Jo Ellen was fixed up by her sister on a blind date with Floyd, who was a young Navy pilot, flew training missions in St. Louis. Pretty much of a whirlwind romance. Jo Ellen had just turned 19 when she married Floyd in October of 1946. Floyd became a welder and a supervisor for the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company, and the couple were very excited to be starting a family of their own.
Young but happy and high hopes.
Like so many of us.
Yeah, that's how we all start out, I guess.
So the Browns' first daughter, Connie, was born in 1948. The Browns lived in a mobile home in Cape Girardeau back then. Then after the birth of Connie, they moved several times for Floyd's job. By the time their third daughter, Karla, was born in 1956, they were living in Lima, Ohio. In 1960, Floyd's job took the family to the St. Louis area, where Jo Ellen had extended family. The Browns settled in a mobile home park in the Illinois suburb of East Alton. And then 2 years later, they bought their first house in a subdivision in Wood River.
Yeah, so Jo Ellen and Floyd spent the next 5 years or so building the best life that they could. Jo Ellen really believed she'd found the perfect marriage because Floyd was a good husband and father and a good provider. Karla's big sisters, Connie and Donna, were good daughters. They were cheerleaders with excellent grades and plans to go to college. And little Karla, a cute and precocious girl, showed the same promise as her sisters. Since her sisters were quite a bit older, Karla enjoyed a very special place as the baby in the family, and she learned early on how to get what she wanted. So she picked up a lot from watching her sisters and often acted older than her years. And Joe Allen sometimes worried that Karla was trying to grow up too fast. Not too uncommon either.
No, I mean, she's got big sisters that are, at least 5-6 years older than her.
Yeah, so she wants to be like them.
Sure.
Yeah. So the little house that Karla and her fiancé bought in 1978 was average. It was just one story with white siding. They did have 2 large trees out front that offered shade for their yard on this quiet street. The lot was really narrow and the neighboring houses were very close together. But this house at 979 Acton Avenue was like a dream home for Mark and Karla. For Karla, this was proof that she and Mark would be married and have a family together. Mark's reluctance to get married, despite living with Karla in an apartment in nearby East Alton, had caused most of their arguments during the 5 years of their relationship. But Karla was sure that he loved her. Still, he'd been reluctant to give up his nights out with the guys, and she didn't like that. But they were really young after all. But now they're getting this house, and Mark had promised that they would get married once they were settled into their new home. Mark and Karla made a pretty good pair. At 22, Karla was a blonde beauty with some enviable curves. She was very petite, too, just 4'10" and maybe 100 pounds. For better or worse, she'd always gotten attention from boys and men. But as a former cheerleader, she did love being the center of attention. She had had several boyfriends over the years, and some people would even describe her as kind of flirty. But her friends realized that the sexy, carefree, and easy personality of Karla was not the real Karla. She loved Mark, and she did have very serious, definite plans for her future with him. Mark was a very handsome young man. He was 27. He had sandy, curly hair and fine, angular features. He was tall and slim, about 6'1", and he would be easy to imagine on a beach in Southern California like a surfer guy. Mark and Karla were excited and joyful during the 2 weeks that they spent working on the house and moving themselves in. Karla had actually taken some time off from her classes at the nearby college, and she was at the house all the time, busily cleaning and decorating. She had painted the basement floor herself, and then she and Mark had set up a couch and tables to have a small TV room down there.
Now, Mark worked as an apprentice electrician, spending his time off at the new house. His friends all knew that he was excited as he talked about his plans for remodeling and decorating. Many from their large group of friends came over to help Karla and Mark move in that Tuesday night, June 20th. They hauled their belongings in boxes, bags, barrels, in several pickup trucks and cars, and distributed items throughout the house. So moving in day, it's a mess.
Yeah, most of the rooms were still cluttered on the 21st, but the bedroom was completely set up, so Mark and Karla had spent their first night in their new home together in comfort. And once the work was done on that evening of the 20th, the couple and their friends had had a spontaneous celebration. They had some beer and played music and danced, and it was really a happy time for a young group that liked to party and have fun. But then on Wednesday the 21st, Mark had to go back to work for the electrical contractor, and Karla planned to spend the day getting work done at the house. After Mark got off work around 4:30, he stopped by the house of an old friend. That's Tom Figgenbaum. And he got him in his pickup truck because he wanted help to move a big doghouse to his new place. The doghouse was at the home of Mark's parents, which was just 2 doors down from Tom's house. So Tom, of course, was happy to help, and they loaded the doghouse into his truck together. Then Mark followed in his car while Tom drove the truck to the new house on Acton. So as Tom backed his pickup into the driveway, Mark made a quick trip into the house. And when he came out, he mentioned that Karla was gone and that she had left the back door unlocked, and this seemed to bother him a little bit. After he and Tom carried the doghouse into the yard, Mark invited Tom in to see the new place. And Mark gave Tom a tour of the main floor. Then he led him down the stairs from the kitchen into the basement. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, Tom saw a very concerned look on Mark's face as he looked around the room. He started toward the coffee table in front of the couch. TV trays and their stand were overturned near one end of the couch, and there were some small dark spots on the floor. So Mark mumbled, "What's going on here?" Then Mark called out for Karla, but there was no answer. And then at that same instant, both of the men looked over to their right through the open swinging doors into the laundry room, and Tom recoiled, just horrified by what he saw. Just a few feet away from where he stood, Karla was on her knees, doubled over at her waist with her head submerged in water that filled one of the 10-gallon barrels the couple had used to move their clothes. Karla's hands were also tied behind her back, and she was naked from the waist down. Mark screamed her name and ran over to her, pulling her head out of the barrel. Then he gently lowered her to the floor. Now, what had once been a beautiful face was puffy and a mottled blue-gray color. She had 2 deep, ugly gashes across the center of her forehead and on the side of her chin. Tom noticed something dark, a man's sock, tied tightly around her neck, just above her brightly colored sweater. Her blonde hair was matted in dark, wet strands over her face, and her eyes were open slightly, staring blankly up at the ceiling. So even through his shock and confusion, Tom was certain that Karla was dead. Mark was crying and moaning as he rocked back and forth, kneeling on the floor beside her. He cradled Karla's head in his arms. "They killed her," he said. "Oh my God, Karla."
Both men looked around the room for a suspect or for some kind of clue as to what had happened. Mark looked down at her body, saw that her knees were still bent up stiffly and slightly apart. He asked Tom to find something to cover her. Tom grabbed a nearby blanket and pulled it over the lower half of Karla's body. Mark told him that they had to call the police, so Tom ran upstairs, used the telephone in the kitchen, called for an ambulance, and for the police.
So dispatcher Bill Redfern was alone at the police station when this call came in, and he immediately sent all 3 officers who were on patrol, that was Sergeant Dick Morris and officers Mark George and Jim Stewart, over to the house. Officer George pulled up first at 5:49 p.m., and saw 2 men standing in the front doorway, Mark and Tom. As he got close to the front porch, he could see that one of them was crying and hysterical. The men kept saying that there was a body in the basement. As they walked through the basement doorway into the room just to the right of the stairway, Officer George saw Karla's body covered with a blanket. He also noticed there was water all over the floor and the room was a mess. Tom had gone back upstairs after hearing someone call out for Officer George, and he was surprised as he reached the living room, and he was confronted by Sergeant Dick Morris, who aimed his pistol at Tom and ordered him to freeze. So Tom quickly raised his hands in front of him and told Morris that the other officer was in the basement, and then he led Morris downstairs. Mark was there crying. "Why'd they have to beat her like that?" he asked. He looked at the officers and then back at Karla's body, and he told the officers that her head had been in the bucket and that she was naked from the waist down. He had pulled her out and covered her up. Sergeant Morris told Officer George to take Tom and Mark upstairs. As the officer escorted Mark up the stairs, his anger and his hurt just overwhelmed him, and Mark turned and punched the wall, actually making a hole in the paneling. Officer Stewart arrived after Morris, finding Mark and Tom now back in the living room, and Mark was just inconsolable. He paced the room, first sitting down on the couch, and then getting up again and pacing around some more. He was rubbing his face with his hands, unable to believe that this had really happened. Officer Stewart looked at Morris as he came back upstairs. Stewart knew him well enough to see that Morris was really shocked by this murder scene.
It was a kind of grisly scene.
Well, yes, and imagine this young man, this is his fiancé.
Yeah.
It had to be horrible. And it was a small area where a lot of people knew her.
Right. And a relatively crime-free area.
Yeah, at least, serious crimes like this.
Right. In fact, the police chief of Wood River, Ralph Skinner, had only dealt with 2 murders in the 4 years since he'd taken the job. Wood River was in Madison County and had a population of almost 250,000, sharing TV stations and major daily newspapers with St. Louis. Wood River was unique in that it was in a major metropolitan area, but it still had a small-town feeling. But for the past few months, Chief Skinner in the city of Wood River had been victimized by a series of sexual attacks perpetrated by a very disturbed person. Although the public knew very little about the details of these attacks, the chief was being pressured by the public to get these crimes solved.
Yeah, actually, Chief Skinner hadn't even been home from work for very long on June 21st when his phone rang at 5:52 p.m. The murder on Acton Avenue was just a few blocks from his own home. A small crowd had already gathered in front of the little white house by the time Skinner had arrived. On the screened-in porch of the house next door, he saw 2 scruffy-looking guys watching the police, and they weren't interacting with the rest of the bystanders, so they seemed to kind of stand out. Skinner would make a mental note of this. As Skinner walked up the sidewalk, he could hear Mark sobbing, "Why her?" repeatedly. Skinner was met at the door by Officer George, who motioned toward the grieving Mark, who was in the living room, explaining that the victim was Mark's girlfriend. It had been difficult to keep him from going back downstairs. Skinner recognized Mark Fair. They'd actually met around town a couple of times. So the chief was surprised by how clean the basement was. It wasn't really the bloody murder scene he had expected. He turned and saw Karla's body under the blanket and was very disturbed by the sight of her bare feet protruding from under the edge. The sight beneath the blanket sickened him. His eyes were drawn then to the sock tied around her throat. The knot had cut into her skin quite deeply, and her sweater was bunched up around her midsection, and she had some very deep cuts on her face. It was quite grisly. Of course, it was too early to make any determinations about what had happened, but the evidence did suggest that a rape sexual assault had happened and that someone had tried to clean up the scene. So Skinner brought in Detective Eldon McEwen and Detective Chuck Nunn. They had both been promoted to detective by the chief, and Skinner trusted them to handle this case. So the detectives arrived at the scene within just a few minutes, and by then it was 6 p.m. McEwen was met by Skinner in the living room and escorted toward the basement. Skinner explained that this was a brutal crime, that the young woman had been fixing up the house to move into, and that she was Mark Fair's fiancé. When the blanket was lifted, McEwen was shocked. He'd never seen anything like it before. He'd seen stabbings and shootings, but nothing had come close to this. The chief described how she had been found bent over in the bucket, and McEwen began to make some observations. Cuts on the face, on the jaw, apparently from some kind of a weapon. Lips were swollen with some blood under her nose. Her hands were tied behind her back, and the cords were cutting deeply into her wrists. So it appeared that she had struggled and that she had been conscious, at least long enough to resist and to try and free herself. The body told him that this was a sexual assault. She had resisted sex, there'd been a struggle, and she was killed. So when Detective Nunn arrived in the basement, someone lifted the blanket again, and he just shook his head. He always tried to remove the humanity from a case like this to try and build up an immunity against shock while he was doing his job. But then he heard the victim's name and his eyes widened. He'd gone to school with Karla's big sisters, and he'd actually known Karla for years. He didn't recognize her now, but this made it harder to distance himself from the victim when it was someone he had known. He was told about the barrel of water, and he realized that the killer was someone who was seriously disturbed. He knew Karla Brown was an athletic girl and a former cheerleader, so he knew she would have fought. She was small, but she was strong. McEwen would glance around the room at the overturned TV trays, and he saw that one of the couch cushions had been shoved over, sticking up over one end of the couch. He turned to Skinner and told him that they needed the most professional person that they had to handle this crime, and that turned out to be Alva Bush.
Yes, Inspector Alva W. Bush had been a crime scene technician for the Illinois State Police for just about a year, and that time had been long enough for him to develop a reputation as a methodical investigator with good instincts. He had worked for 5 years as a city cop in nearby Collinsville, then another 14 months as an undercover narc to infiltrate drug traffickers. Bush was at the crime lab at about 6:30 p.m. when he got the call about Karla's murder. Now, as investigators waited for Bush to arrive at the scene, dispatcher Bill Redfern was relieved at the communications desk so he could take the crime scene photos. Photography was his hobby, and even though he wasn't the official department photographer, he often did so. Redfern had known Mark Fair and Karla Brown as just acquaintances, and he had gone to school with Tom Feigenbaum.
Yeah, the basement, particularly the disheveled couch, suggested that there had been a struggle. It wasn't clear if the TV trays had been knocked over during the struggle or if they were just part of the clutter of moving in. He didn't get close to the body, knowing that Alva Bush would not want anyone disturbing the scene, but it did seem like a long time before Bush arrived. After Skinner had given him a briefing, Bush first looked over the outside of the home, and he found no signs of forced entry. Nothing looked suspicious in the yard or the neighborhood. He went inside and made a note of the floor plan upstairs before he went downstairs. And as he reached the bottom of the stairs, he caught sight of Karla's body. The blanket had been removed now, and he could see that Karla was wearing only a sweater. So, of course, it looked like a sexual homicide. There was a wet pair of blue jeans between her body and the barrel, but a pair of panties and any other clothing that you would have expected to see were missing.
As soon as he saw the couch against the wall, with the left cushion shoved away from the middle and sticking up on the far end, Bush suspected that there had been a life-and-death struggle there. Karla had most likely been lying on her back with her head at the right end. She had tried to brace her feet, digging in her heels to get traction to push away from her attacker, and her feet had pushed the cushion away from her to the left end of the sofa. He looked into a cup sitting on the coffee table. There was a little dark liquid in it, likely coffee or tea, but the cup also had a dental bridge with 2 teeth in it. Well, that made no sense, unless it had been knocked from her mouth in the attack.
And I guess that's what they did think happened. It was hers.
So the killer was neat and he picked it up and put it in the mug?
I don't know. I don't know how that happened. Probably not, no.
Near the cup on the table was another telling piece of evidence, and that was a used tampon. This just reinforced the sexual motive for the killing.
Well, absolutely. Then on the floor near the right end of the couch, there were a few droplets of blood, and he felt like he could tell a lot by looking at those. He began a search for more blood by the couch, and it really bothered him when he saw none because there should have been blood there from the struggle that had shoved the cushion over. So he looked back at the drops and noticed that some of them had some small teardrop-like tails at the end. So this indicated that they were moving at an angle when they hit the floor. To Bush, this suggested movement toward the laundry room, where her body was found. So as Bush looked down into Karla Brown's face for the first time, her eyes just stared back. This young woman had been savagely murdered in her own home, just when her life was beginning. She was unpacking her own stuff, minding her own business, and then someone had violated her and killed her. While Bush was at the crime scene, Sergeant McEwen took Mark Fair and his friend Tom to the police station for interviews and written statements. Mark didn't want to leave the house, but Tom convinced him that it was for the best. McEwen then sent other officers out to canvass the neighborhood. On such a quiet street with the houses so close together, someone had to have seen something like a strange man on the street or maybe an unknown car driving down the block. A small thing could break open this case, and missing it could lead to years of it going unsolved. So McEwen took Tom into the interview room first, leaving Officer Stewart to try and keep Mark calm in the hallway. McEwen started by asking general questions at about 6:20 p.m., and it took only 15 minutes for Tom to give a straightforward account of what had happened. He agreed to be fingerprinted so the police could eliminate his prints if they were found at the scene, too. Before ending his interview, McEwen asked Tom if he thought that Mark could have killed Karla, and Tom answered strongly, "Absolutely not. He was with me. He couldn't have done it. Absolutely not." McEwen thought Mark's emotional and angry reaction to Karla's murder had been perfectly normal. He'd seen no hint of anything suspicious from Mark, and it didn't make any sense to McEwen that a man who'd been living with a woman and planned to marry her would commit such a brutal, sexually oriented crime against her. They would check Mark out completely anyway, of course, because he was the fiancé.
And probably the last one to see her alive, other than the killer.
Maybe, yep.
So Chief Skinner was very worried about Mark being a possible suspect. With no signs of forced entry into the home, Karla may very well have been killed by someone she knew and had let into the house. Although it was still a mess from the moving process, the house had not been ransacked, and it appeared that nothing had been stolen. Skinner knew they would have to take a very close look at Mark. The violence was so extreme that someone had to be very angry at her to do that much damage to her face. So while McEwen was questioning Tom, Mark's parents arrived at the police station. Both Robert and Evelyn Fair were badly shaken. They were consoling their son when Tom and McEwen came out of the interview room together. It was an emotional scene in the hallway, and it appeared that Mark and his parents did care very much for Karla. So Mark was interviewed for about half an hour that day. He broke down several times, crying, rocking back and forth. His story of June 21st was simple but painful to hear. McEwen had seen Mark's beautiful young fiancée dead and beaten on the floor. It was difficult to imagine how tough this was for someone who had loved her and planned to spend the rest of his life with her.
Well, yeah, sure. I can't imagine.
Oh, no kidding. Mark couldn't think of any motives or suspects, but he did suggest that the police check out Jack Myers. This guy is a local suspected drug dealer, well known to the cops. Myers had hit on Karla repeatedly, almost refusing to take no for an answer. And she had despised him, Mark said. Mark didn't know anyone in the new neighborhood. Remember, they just moved in the day before.
Right.
He said that he and Karla had introduced themselves to the neighbors living on either side of their new house while they had been working there, but Mark couldn't remember their names.
He couldn't remember, and speaking of memory issues, I think maybe this is a good time to talk about something that's helped me with that. It's called Magic Mind. Now, I admit I've had issues remembering things and keeping my focus, right?
Yeah, like, where'd I put my phone?
Yeah, that happens a lot. And even though I put 100% into researching and putting out our podcast, I admit it can be tough for me to organize and keep all the little details together. So here's the deal. I've started drinking these little green shots in the morning, and I do love them. They help me get focused and stay focused, and I have enough energy to be super organized and productive without drinking coffee all day. Don't you think?
Definitely.
Yeah, so Magic Mind contains matcha, and this has way less caffeine than coffee, and it has additional compounds too, called catechins, that actually extend the benefits of caffeine by slowing down your body's ability to absorb it. So this prevents that inevitable crash that comes when you drink too much caffeine. So for me, I just think of matcha as nature's extended release version of caffeine.
Good description.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it because that's how I feel about it. I don't get the jitters. It just kind of keeps me alert on a long-term basis throughout the day. So knowing how well Magic Mind has worked for me, I would really encourage just about everyone to try it out. If you've ever had trouble being 100% focused, Magic Mind could be the answer for you too. And that's why we're excited to share the super offer the Magic Mind team has created for us.
You get 56% off your first subscription in the next 10 days and 20% off your one-time purchase with our code BREWERY20. That's BREWERY20. You can get it at www.magicmind.com/brewery and redeem the discount code BREWERY20. But hurry up because the 56% discount only lasts for 10 days after our episode airing date.
That's right, and that's Brewery, BREWERY20 at www.magicmind.com/BREWERY. Sound good?
Give me some.
Okay. So Mark did tell the detective that his mother, Evelyn Fair, had called Karla that morning to talk about the house and how the move-in was coming along. During their conversation at about 11 a.m., Karla said someone was at the door and she had to go. She said she would call Evelyn back, but she never did. And when Evelyn called her back at about 1 p.m., no one answered. So this was the first possible break in solving the case, because maybe they had the time of the murder, and maybe someone had seen the murderer at the door. Officers canvassing the neighborhood now had something to follow up on at least. They already had the feeling that the scene would give them very little evidence that would point directly to the killer, because this was before DNA was even on their radar.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty nice break.
Yes.
Just because
it's important, because she was there all day alone.
Yeah. And, you know, if the mother, her future mother-in-law called her and was, you know, someone's at the door, I'll call you right back, and you never get called back.
Right.
Certainly makes you suspicious that something had happened.
That's when the person arrived.
Right.
Yeah, I
and
agree.
Then when Evelyn called Karla back around 1, there was no answer.
Right.
So I think they got a pretty good timetable there.
I think they saw it as possibly a good break, yeah. So the police had to interview everyone in Karla and Mark's circle of friends, now especially those who had been at that impromptu house party the night before. Something could have happened then to set off her killer, perhaps. McEwen and the other officers had heard occasional mentions of Mark, Karla, and some of their friends in connection with drug use, but this was just recreational use and mostly just marijuana. But still, it could be a lead because they had to get it from someone. Some of the party goers could have been what Officer Nunn called pooches, which are small-time drug couriers. McEwen also knew that Karla was considered an attractive young woman, and she had dated quite a bit around town. Maybe someone she had rejected could have been upset that she and Mark were engaged and planning a life together. So overall, there were a lot of questions, but not a lot of answers. Investigators did not believe that Karla's murder was connected to the other sexual assaults in town either, because none of those included any violent injuries. Even when the attacker had broken in and forced the women to perform sex acts while he was holding a butcher knife, he never stabbed anyone. Also, those attacks had all happened at night, which makes it different. So a link couldn't be ruled out, of course, without additional investigation, but it didn't seem very likely. McEwen believed that the killing of Karla Brown would shock that small Wood River community like no other crime had for decades.
Investigator Bush concluded early on that Karla had already been dead when her head was pushed into the barrel of water. The water had only the slightest red tint, showing that she had not bled much into the barrel. Then post-mortem lividity, the settling of the blood on the lowest portion of the body after death, was on the front of Karla's upper body, which was confirming the doubled-over face-down position after death. Bush rejected the idea that Karla had drowned, despite the froth that was around her nose. That happened, he believed, when Mark Fair pulled her body out of the water, which forced out the air that was trapped in her lungs and throat when she was bent over the edge of the barrel. And if she had been alive when pushed into the water, there should have been signs of a struggle to hold her head underwater.
Right, yeah, I would think so.
And there's nothing in the room that suggested the kind of struggle that he thought had happened on the couch.
Right, so moving on to consider those cuts on Karla's face, Bush wondered why they were parallel. It looked as if one object had made both cuts at the same time. He looked into the cuts to examine the skin bridging, which is like those slivers of skin still spanning the wounds, and that suggested an object with a sharp edge that had been used with significant force. There was something else about the cuts that bothered him too. He knew gashes that deep across someone's head would cause a lot of bleeding. Under the force that caused those wounds, the blood actually would have spurted out from the skin and splattered some nearby surfaces. So he concluded Karla hadn't been killed in the area where she was found. There was virtually no blood in that confined space. So he believed that she had actually died on the couch.
Now, there were two men's socks, one black-colored and one blue, that were tied around Karla's neck with two neat knots. They were far too neat for someone who was in a struggle. Now, Bush would find the mate to the black sock beneath the couch, and the other blue sock in Mark's dresser upstairs. Karla's top was a short-sleeved, multicolored sweater that seemed too heavy to be worn in the summer by a woman working around the house. But what bothered him more than that was a single barrel-shaped button at the top of the neck. It was still buttoned and held in place by a thin fabric loop. So in a life-or-death struggle, it seemed impossible that the loop wouldn't have been broken.
Yeah, but that really turns out to be kind of nothing, because what are we saying here? That someone changed her shirt?
Yeah, I just looked at that, meaning that it didn't support the idea that there had been a huge struggle.
Okay, so maybe not as much of a struggle as we thought. Or maybe the sweater just wasn't involved in it. Maybe he didn't grab the sweater and pull on it,
Yeah.
And things like that could happen. But then on her abdomen, just below the bottom of her sweater, and also on her left arm, Bush did notice some fluid that could have been dried semen. So he scraped that off gently and collected that as potential evidence.
Yeah, good.
Now Karla's right arm was pinned beneath her body. Her left arm was bent up at the elbow with her left hand above the floor. The white cord binding her arms was a double-strand electrical cord that had been split down the middle, and it was tied around her wrists in several loops. But there was too much cord between her wrists, and this would have allowed Karla enough movement to grab at her attacker as he forced himself on top of her. Bush didn't believe that any rapist would tie up a victim like that because it defeated the purpose. So this was another part of the staging, he believed. He also looked for broken fingernails, but they were all intact, so that was a little curious. Then Bill Redfern was allowed to return to the basement and take the pictures. Bush didn't ask, but he did assume that Redfern's camera was loaded with color film. And that assumption would come back to haunt Bush later in the investigation. Bush was certain that the crime didn't happen the way that the scene looked, and he was becoming more and more sure that the killer had tried to stage the scene. So while Bush worked in the basement, a telephone call and a knock on the door had brought in some new and helpful information. Jamie Hale, an old friend of Karla's, called in to report that she had talked to Karla on the phone between 9 and 9:30 that morning, and they had made plans for Jamie to stop by Karla's house that afternoon. But she was supposed to call first to make sure Karla was there, and when Jamie did call around 2:30, no one answered. That's not surprising because when the future mother-in-law called at 1 or so, there was no answer. Another friend came to the house with a similar story. Debbie Davis had talked to Karla on the phone at 10 a.m., making arrangements to stop by later. But when she arrived at 11, no one answered her knock on the door. So was the attack still happening at that point, or was it over? That's right around the time of the murder.
Yeah, and it's right around the time that Karla had been talking to her future mother-in-law.
Right.
So all those different statements kind of agree with each other.
As far as the timing, yeah. Another person in the crowd outside of Karla's house that night was Joe Shepard Sr., and that was Karla's former stepfather. He had a lot of questions, and his demeanor drew the attention of the investigators. Sergeant Morris was sent over to calm him down, but the police would hear about him again later. The initial canvass of the neighborhood produced no useful information. The men living on each side of Karla's house had been home all day, but said they hadn't seen anything unusual. The neighbor on the west side, Artie McMillan, had seen Mark leave for work about 7:30 in the morning and arrive home with a friend about 5:30. The young man on the east side, Paul Main, said he had spent the early afternoon sitting on his front porch with his friend, John Pranty. They had noticed nothing unusual between noon and 3, he said, when Pranty left and Main returned to his job where he was painting a house just down on the corner of the block.
Well, Bush decided to check the back door again for signs of forced entry. He didn't find any signs of a break-in, but Bush caught something he had missed before. A couple of tiny smears of what appeared to be blood were on the doorframe. Then Bush found more blood spots on the gatepost in the backyard. The killer had probably left by the back door and through the gate, with some of Karla's blood still on him. Bush returned to examine the blood drops in the basement. He hoped he could follow their path to figure out how the body was moved into the room, where it was found from the couch where she had been killed.
Right. So, interestingly, though, there were no drops of blood near the water barrel. Maybe too much water had been splashed around when Karla's body was pulled from the barrel, but Bush found drops along the floor, on boxes, and on a rumpled-up sheet, and the drops went across the room to the couch, confirming to Bush that that was the place where Karla was killed. As Bush crouched down, he was pretty shocked to see a pint or even more of water in an irregular puddle about 3 feet across. And from the puddle, the water trailed off under the couch and along the edge of the wall that was behind it, and the water did have a slight red tint. Bush also found traces of blood on the cushion where he believed Karla's head had been during her struggle. But with the cuts she had, the couch should have been practically covered with blood. But when he touched the cushion, he found that it was just soaked with water, and the water under the couch had drained down through from that cushion. So the killer had definitely tried to change the crime scene. He'd tried to clean it up and misdirect investigators. Bush really wanted to find what the killer had used to carry the water to the couch. The cup on the table still had some brown liquid, and it would have taken a lot of trips to move the water 1 cupful at a time. So Chief Skinner took another look around upstairs later, and standing in the kitchen scanning the scene, he noticed a Mr. Coffee maker on the counter. And in the sink was the brown plastic lid from the glass carafe. So where was the carafe? The police began an all-out search in the house looking for that, and they ended up back in the basement. Skinner was pretty startled when he looked up and saw the carafe was wedged into the X-shaped supports of the floor joists right above the furnace. So Bush was called back to the scene, and he was relieved and shook his head as he looked into the rafters. Then he put the carafe and the plastic lid into evidence bags for the lab to test.
Karla's mother, Jo Ellen, lived in nearby Richmond Heights. She saw Mark walking to her front door on June 21st, 1978, and she saw his mother get out of her car behind him. And when the police had called her back in 1967 to tell her there had been an accident at work, she had known that her husband already was dead. The family had suffered when Floyd died at such a young age, and now Joellen's baby daughter was dead from a violent attack. As Mark hurried toward the door, Joellen knew that her daughter was dead. She had just talked to Karla on the phone the day before, and Karla had seemed so happy, like she was just about to get everything she had ever wanted in life. Her friends and her mother knew that Karla wanted a husband and a family, and now she's gone.
Yeah, Joellen really couldn't follow Mark's words as he broke the news to her, and there weren't many details, just that her daughter Karla had been murdered. Joellen called the oldest of her 3 daughters Connie. Connie was 30 now and lived in Connecticut with her husband and their 7-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son. Joellen couldn't find the strength to break the news to her daughter, so she tried to tell Connie's husband. But she couldn't get the words out, so she handed the phone over to Evelyn Fair, Mark's mother. When Connie's husband Ralph relayed the message to Connie, she was in disbelief. She couldn't absorb the news. Karla had just spent more than a month visiting her in Connecticut. She had watched her niece and nephew for 2 weeks while Connie and her husband went on a trip to Europe. So Karla couldn't have been back home for more than 3 weeks when she was killed. Mark and his mother stayed at Joellen's house for a while that evening, but there really wasn't much for them to say to each other. Poor Joellen was just devastated, and Mark himself wasn't doing well either. But Joellen had noticed that Mark's knuckles were badly skinned, and after she was alone with the tragic news, Joellen took some Valium and had herself a few drinks, and she started chain-smoking cigarettes. And the more she thought about her tragic loss, the angrier and more suspicious she became. Now she wanted to know what had happened and why no one was giving her any details. So by 3 a.m., when the anger had continued to fester, she called the police, and they were good enough to send out an officer to talk with her. The officer listened sympathetically, even when she wondered aloud if the man sent to tell her about her daughter's murder was actually the one who had killed her, Mark.
Now, detectives considered everyone Karla knew, and that was including her fiancé Mark, to be a suspect. But they really had little to go on. In the early hours of Thursday, June 22nd, as he read the reports on Karla's murder, Bush decided that the second day should begin with interviews of the people who had been at the moving party. Obviously, these were some of the last people to see Karla alive.
Well, yeah, of course.
So Mark met Detective McEwen at the police station at 9 a.m. to give a detailed account of the moving party and a list of the 10 people who were there. Mark agreed to help contact them to ask that they each go to the police station for interviews. These interviews later that day began to give investigators a glimpse of Karla as she was seen through the eyes of her friends. She was a popular young woman, genuinely loved by those close to her. Some of her girlfriends couldn't stop crying as they talked about her. Young men respected her and cared about her. Bob and Debbie Davis said Karla mentioned being a little afraid of the old man next door. He was always drinking and dirty, and Karla thought he was scary. Debbie also said Karla had gone out with a guy in Connecticut when Karla and Mark had broken up briefly, and Karla had gone to visit her sister Connie. Karla later said that the guy was coming to visit her. Debbie had heard that Karla had been raped once at a swimming party, and Debbie gave the police the name of the man who she thought had been Karla's rapist.
So they're gathering a list of suspects. And of course, the former stepfather, Joe Shepard Sr., was mentioned with suspicion by Debbie Davis and Carolyn Thompson, 2 of Karla's girlfriends. Debbie Davis said Karla recently went to dinner with Shepard, something Debbie thought was unwise because Shepard had treated Karla badly when they had lived in the same house together. But Karla had shrugged this off, and it wasn't discussed again. Carolyn Thompson told the detective that if anyone killed Karla, she suspected Joe Shepard. She explained that Shepard had hit Karla while he was married to her mother.
And Carolyn also said that Shepard was always trying to get Karla's friends to have sex with him.
Well, there's a huge red flag. Can you imagine?
You think?
Oh, my God.
In fact, he once climbed into bed with Carolyn and tried to rape her when she spent the night with Karla after their high school graduation party.
Well, that's gross.
When Carolyn got away from him, Shepard had warned her to keep quiet about it or she'd be sorry. Carolyn also said Shepard claimed to be connected to organized crime. He had told the girls they could make extra money by working for him as prostitutes at a local nightclub. Boy, this guy's a real saint, isn't he?
What was Joe Ellen thinking there, marrying that guy? Well, the second thing that came up was an account by some of Karla's friends about her contact the night of the party with someone next door at 989 Acton, and that's where Paul Main lived. Karla had been seen talking to a rough-looking, long-haired guy next door. McEwen went back to Paul Main's house that same day. Main was a thin, scraggly-looking 20-year-old guy, and John Pranty was an acquaintance who had been to his house 2 or 3 times, including the night before the murder. Pranty said he had thought about going to Karla's party to have a beer, but he never went over, Main said. Main couldn't give an address for Pranty's house, which he said was near a lake in Bethalto, but Main did have a phone number for Pranty. And Main also consented to have his fingerprints taken and a photo taken of him. Karla's autopsy was done by Dr. Harry Parks, and he had performed autopsies for Madison County and other counties in southwestern Illinois since 1964. He began the autopsy with an external exam, and he noted that Karla's body had many marks that were indicative of a struggle. Even her knees were bruised and battered, and he thought that may have been from being dragged across the floor. Karla's neck and throat were badly bruised, especially in the area where the socks had been tightly tied. And there were other small marks in that area, but they seemed kind of unremarkable. There was a small cut on the side of her nose, and from the description of the crime scene, Dr. Parks concluded that the larger gashes were suffered just before or after death. If they had happened well before death, there would have been more blood at the scene because the face tends to bleed a lot. The doctor found a severe fracture of the jaw right at the point of her chin. The X-ray report from the hospital showed that there were no skull fractures. As he examined the many bruises around the throat and neck, he became reasonably sure that the cause of death would be strangulation by garroting. That's the use of the cord or something similar around the throat. And death by strangulation was supported by injuries to the soft tissues and the muscles of her neck, as well as the structures in Karla's throat. The injuries had caused hemorrhages through the lining of her larynx. The front of the esophagus also showed injuries consistent with strangulation. That was the cause of death, he concluded. Dr. Parks did find some congestion, but no water in her lungs. And to him, that eliminated drowning and further supported strangulation. His medical opinion was that she was already dead when her head was put into that water.
Now, Bush was pleased that his observations at the scene agreed with the doctor's conclusions. Both men agreed that the froth around the nose and mouth came from air being forced out of Karla's lungs as she was bent over the barrel or removed from it. But Dr. Parks was not as sure about the results of the rape exam. There were no external injuries as sometimes happen with forcible rape. Some sperm was found in the vagina, but the amount was small, so it could suggest an incomplete sex act or intercourse much as a couple days earlier.
The results of the toxicological test came in a week later, showing no drugs or alcohol in Karla's system. Bill Redfern took the photos at the autopsy, too. As Dr. Parks pulled Karla's chin up to expose the injuries of her neck, Redfern had to move in low to get a good angle. But his camera with a pistol grip made the shot hard to get, and as the camera moved in for a close-up, the lower area in the frame went out of his view. So he couldn't get too close or too low because the grip held the camera away from the body. Unfortunately, this was a photo that would become very important in the investigation. That Friday morning, detectives learned from Karla's sister Connie that the man Karla had dated in Connecticut that May had bothered her for more dates after they had gone out a couple of times. But then he was eliminated as a suspect when his employer said he had visited several customers in southern New Jersey on the day of Karla's death. James Moses, who had lived in the house on Acton before selling it to Mark and Karla, said his mother had been driving his 6-year-old son to the dentist on the morning of Karla's murder when they saw a woman they believed was Karla Brown talking with a man in her driveway. The grandmother, Edna Moses, told investigators that she had missed the street for the dentist's office and then turned onto Acton and then did a turnaround in the driveway of her son's former house, and that was at about 10:45 a.m. She said she had seen a big man with a full face and a heavy build wearing a white shirt and dark pants, and he was talking to a small blonde woman who turned and walked away as Mrs. Moses pulled up. The man had also turned, so she didn't get a good look at his face. She looked through 3 books of mug shots but wasn't able to find a match. So she suggested that the police talk to her grandson, Eric. Although he was only 6, he had a good memory, and she thought he might be able to identify the man. But meanwhile, Mark was beating himself up with regret and guilt. Why hadn't he married Karla long ago? Why hadn't he avoided the fights and the hurt feelings and all their separations? He asked himself why he hadn't gone home for lunch that day, even though he had never eaten lunch at home. But there was no consoling him. At Karla's funeral, he was just a broken man, crying and unable to speak for long before sobbing. Karla's mother was still looking suspiciously at Mark, but Mark had a solid alibi and showed no signs of being capable of hurting Karla.
The police soon got around to interviewing some possibly suspicious men. Karla had found 67-year-old neighbor Artie McMillan a little threatening and felt uncomfortable when he and his friends were sitting around in his backyard. But McMillan said that he was nothing but friendly to her. He even remembered when she lived in the duplex on the corner with her mother years before. When McMillan took a polygraph 2 months later, the examiner gave him a qualified rating as truthful when he denied involvement in Karla's death.
Yeah, and then the man accused of raping Karla at the pool party was ruled out as well.
Yeah, he ended up admitting that he had made advances to Karla, but then he got beat up by some other guys for doing this transgression. He also had a solid alibi.
He did, so he was ruled out. Then 6 former boyfriends of Karla were located, and some hardly qualified as boyfriends. They all told similar accounts of dating her once or twice while she and Mark were separated. Remember, she was only 22 when she died, and she'd been in this relationship with Mark for 5 years.
Yeah.
So really, the only other boyfriends she had were during these breakups with Mark. And these guys all thought Karla loved Mark, and they all spoke very highly of her. So not one of them registered as a suspect in this case. Investigators had scheduled John Pranty for a polygraph after noticing a contradiction between his account of the day of the murder and the information from his friend he was hanging out with next door, Paul Main. And they both agreed that they had sat on Main's porch Tuesday night and watched Karla's moving party. But according to Main, Pranty returned on Wednesday, June 21st, and they sat on the porch again from about noon to 3 or 4 p.m. when Pranty left and Main returned to his job painting a house on the corner. Pranty, on the other hand, said he stopped by Main's house about 8:30 that morning after putting in job applications at the nearby Shell oil refinery. Pranty asked if Main wanted to go with him on an application filing tour of St. Louis, but Main took a pass because he had a job painting a house down the street. But in Pranty's account, he had left on his search for a job and never went back that day. Paul Main and John Pranty had no criminal records, and neither of them seemed really threatening or dangerous. They were just kind of potheads. But this conflict in their stories really nagged at the investigators. Having failed to get Pranty to take a polygraph test, clean and sober, the week before, they decided to go to his house on Wednesday, July 5th, 2 weeks after Karla was killed, to try and do it again.
Yeah, then the detective explained why he wanted Pranty to go over that account of the morning again. Pranty stared back blankly and then agreed that Main's version could be correct. Pranty may have been at Main's house, as Main had said, maybe even from noon until 3 or 4. A lot of times I can't remember things that happened the day before, Pranty said. But Pranty did remember the events of the night before Karla Brown was murdered. He had hoped to be invited to the party that Main's new neighbors were throwing next door, and had commented that the girl who was moving in there was really beautiful. Pranty had wanted to join the party, but was not welcomed. He still seemed disappointed, as recalled that he eventually went home. Pranty couldn't remember what time he finished the job search the next day, or if he had returned to Main's house. He did remember that later that evening, around 6 o'clock, when he was at a friend's house on Hamilton Avenue, Paul came over and told him that that good-looking girl next door to him had been killed.
So Pranty agreed to have his picture and fingerprints taken, and also to take a polygraph exam. Back at the police station, while detectives were scheduling Pranty's polygraph for a week and a half later, Chief Skinner was on the phone, double-checking Pranty's story. So the personnel departments at Shell, McDonnell Douglas, and Rockwell did have applications from John Pranty dated from the morning of June 21st, just as Pranty had said, and the evidence suggested that Maine's recollection probably was incorrect. Pranty's name came up again when they showed the photos collected during the investigation to the woman and her grandson who had turned their car around in Karla's driveway on the morning of her murder. Edna Moses and 6-year-old Eric Moses were unable to identify any of the photos as the man they had seen standing with Karla in the driveway. The man had worn glasses and a cap, which caused his dark curly hair to stand out on the sides. He also had a mustache and a beard. So that sounded pretty close to Pranty, except for the beard, and Eric seemed pretty sure about the beard. Eric had probably seen the killer standing with Karla, but Eric's young age made it difficult to get a definite identification. The man had been big, but everyone looks big to a 6-year-old, especially if that man was standing next to the very petite Karla. She wasn't even 5 feet tall. So the chance to question one suspect at the top of the list came on July 6th. That's when 2 investigators sat down with Jack Myers at his apartment in Roxana. He had no felony arrests, but had been in trouble off and on for years, and he was suspected of being a mid-level drug dealer. This muscled, rough-looking guy was 5 feet 10, and a couple of his girlfriends claimed that he had beaten them. One was completely convinced that he was capable of murder. Myers still talked about Karla and became angry if anyone mentioned her plans to marry Mark Fair. And Myers claimed he and Karla had been very close, but she wouldn't settle down with him because she was bisexual.
Where'd that come from?
Yeah, that's totally out of the blue. Nobody else has said anything like that. But Myers seemed to know an awful lot about Karla's death, claiming she was badly beaten and dumped into water, and he also knew that some hairs had been found. But most of this stuff I just told you about him was from his former girlfriends and people that didn't like him.
Yeah.
There was one girlfriend who did have a higher opinion of Myers. He had dropped by her house on the night Karla's body was found, and she had asked him to drive her by Karla's. But he would have missed the turn onto Acton if she hadn't alerted him. So she had concluded that Myers wasn't even sure where Karla lived, and she really couldn't believe that he would have harmed Karla. So with all of his background in mind, the police were surprised when Myers seemed eager to talk with them. He was hearing the same rumors that were linking him to Karla's murder, and he wanted to set the record straight. He had known Karla for the last year. He even took her out for drinks a few times and considered her to be a good friend. But he said there'd been no sexual relationship, and he never would have done anything to hurt her. He didn't believe Karla's murder was drug-related at all. He said he learned of the murder from Karla's old friend, Debbie Davis. She had called him at home about 8:30 that night, and he was so shocked that he had called Karla's house to confirm her death with the police officer who answered the phone there. He couldn't remember where he'd been earlier the day Karla died, but he was willing to take a polygraph.
On Monday, July 11th, the state lab filed its report on the evidence. All of the blood samples came back as type A, which was Karla's type, or there was insufficient blood for analysis. The dried material scraped off Karla's abdomen was not semen or any other bodily fluid, and it remained unidentified. Tests for sexual assault were inconclusive. The scrapings from under Karla's fingernails were too small to analyze, and the hair found in Karla's hand were animal hair, most likely her dog's.
Yeah, tests on the 4 pieces of electrical wire that had bound Karla's hands or were found on the couch showed that they had once been a single continuous length of wire, but tests on the clipped ends didn't match any knife found at the house. On July 14th and 17th, polygraphs were given to 3 more men on the list of possible suspects, and only Paul Maines was remarkable. He denied seeing anyone enter Karla's house or knowing who had killed her. He said John Pranty had been with him on the afternoon Karla was killed, but the polygraph examiner was unable to give a definite opinion because of Maine's erratic emotions throughout the test. So this uncertain result confirmed Maine's place on the short list of suspects. John Pranty and Jack Myers passed their polygraphs 3 days later, denying any involvement in the killing. Assistant State Attorney Joseph Brown got an unexpected visit at his office on July 21st from 3 of Karla Brown's friends. And they politely but firmly asked why Karla's death was unsolved, and they offered to explain why they believed that Jack Myers was their prime suspect. They had decided on Myers because of his obvious sexual attraction to Karla, his criminal history, his history of beating women, and his very hostile relationship with Mark Fair. All 3 women had heard about a violent confrontation between Myers and Karla Brown when he drove her home one night, made a pass at her in the car, ripped her blouse when she resisted, and Karla had run away. So Myers was a convenient suspect, but there just really wasn't enough for the prosecutors to arrest him. They had no proof that he'd done anything.
No, other than being kind of an idiot.
Yeah, an idiot, into drugs, He certainly wasn't eliminated, but he couldn't be arrested.
No. Then in the last week of July, the police got a break in a series of sex offenses in Wood River. A guy named Tony Garza, who was a scraggly, bearded 21-year-old, was arrested as he climbed into his car a few blocks from a house where a woman had just reported that a man had climbed into her bed and tried to rape her. Her screams had scared him off. This woman identified Garza as her would-be rapist. Now, Garza lived just 6 blocks from the little white house where Karla was murdered a month earlier. So that put Garza on the list of suspects. But none of the sex crimes carried the kind of violence inflicted on Karla.
No, and Garza had admitted to 2 sexual assaults. I did some of the others, he said, but I didn't have anything to do with her murder. He said he was sick and tired of the allegations, and he agreed to take a polygraph. So on Tuesday, July 25th, the polygraph exam was given, and Garza did pass, so his claims of innocence were at least registering as truthful. I don't know how much they were relying on these polygraphs, though. Maybe a little bit too much.
Yeah.
I don't think they're really that reliable.
Well, at the same time, they probably aren't.
Well, right, exactly. Well, we're going to talk later about how a lot of things just aren't as reliable as the police seem to think they are.
Yes, we will. But I'd also say, already maybe not decided, but they were thinking that whoever was behind the rapes was probably not the person who had killed Karla.
Right. They thought that from the start. So he's still on the list, I think, even with a past polygraph.
Yeah.
But maybe not high on the list. So Karla's case was unsolved, and her family and Mark were becoming very impatient and frustrated with the investigation. You can't blame them. Then, in the spring of 1979, Bush met with Inspector Don Greer of the Wood River Police. Now there was a new chief, Duke Goris, and he had made Greer a detective. And Greer was assigned to the Karla Brown case to reorganize its files and look for any new angles to pursue. So he and Bush went over the evidence, including the barrel. And by the way, the barrel did have Mark written on the side, but they were moving their things in it, so really doesn't mean anything. But it bothered Greer because he'd been friends with Mark for years, but he had this suspicion that Mark was Karla's killer. And that was mainly because this type of murder usually was committed by someone the victim trusted enough to allow into her home. But I think we have to put Mark aside because he was at work. They were getting along great. They were moving into their house. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I think he's got an alibi anyway.
He has an alibi, yeah. That's right there. That should be enough. So Greer made a list of the most likely suspects. And to him, that was Jack Myers, the drug-dealing guy, Tony Garza, who was the rapist, Artie McMillan, who was the older guy on the opposite side of Karla's house, and Mark Fair, the fiancé. He agreed to look for ways to eliminate some of these men. And Bush had begun researching a new application of lasers in forensic science by this time. Green lasers were being used to detect fingerprints that were not suitable for lifting with standard powder. Bush wondered if the laser could be used on the glass coffee carafe that he was sure had been used by the killer to pour water on Karla on the couch. So while Bush worked on Karla's case, a case he had handled a year or so after Karla's murder was processing a stolen car that had been abandoned in East St. Louis. The car belonged to someone from New Mexico who was murdered and burned horribly in his own bed, and in late June of 1980, Bush flew to Albuquerque to testify in the trial of the man charged with murdering the owner of this car. So since Bush knew no one in town, he went over to the sheriff's department and checked in with the crime scene technicians there, and they just sat around sharing stories with each other. And during these conversations, one of them mentioned getting good results analyzing photos with a new technique called computer image enhancement. The computer transformed an image in a picture from one-dimensional to three-dimensional, and then turned it on different planes to provide different views and perspectives. Bush was fascinated and asked to hear more about this technique, and a leading expert in the field, Dr. Homer Campbell of the University of Arizona, was about to present a program in the Sheriff's Department on the emerging forensic sciences of image enhancement and bite marks. So Bush was honored to be allowed into a program that was designed mostly for pathologists. And Bush was really awed by this Dr. Campbell, and Dr. Campbell was a forensic odontologist.
Tooth expert.
Right, basically. So Bush wondered if this new technique could identify the object that had made the cuts and other injuries to Karla Brown's face. Bush took Dr. Campbell aside and asked if he could spare a few minutes and explained about an unsolved case back in Illinois and the injuries to Karla Brown. Could Dr. Campbell's image enhancement technique provide new leads about what had been used to cut Karla? Dr. Campbell agreed to study some of the photos if Bush would send them to him. So Bush was able to get the go-ahead to contact the Wood River Police and arrange to provide the photos. The Wood River Police were really pleased with these new ideas and very optimistic that maybe there could be an application in Karla's case that would help.
Yeah, still though, Inspector Greer couldn't get past the contradictions between the stories of Paul Main and John Prantey. As investigators discussed the stories by Main and Prantey, a consensus developed that Main's version of the events was looking more suspicious. Greer had found a report that said the polygraph examiner had concluded that Main was truthful on the test and had not been involved in the homicide. McEwen had used the polygraph to all but eliminate Main as a suspect. Now, as Greer continued to look through the file, however, he found the examiner's actual report, and it was not at all exculpatory. According to the examiner, Main gave the shakiest performance among everyone that was polygraphed. He exhibited erratic and inconsistent emotional disturbances, so substantial that the examiner was unable to give an opinion on the truthfulness of Main's denials.
Yeah, it was actually John Prantey who passed his polygraph without any doubts from the examiner. Main, by both men's accounts, never left home on the day of the murder. He was right next door to Karla the whole time. He had tried to place his buddy Prantey there during the most likely hours of the murder. John Prantey, on the other hand, thought he was at Main's for only a short time in the morning. If he did return later, as Main claimed, Prantey couldn't remember it. Prantey's account of visiting some local businesses to file job applications that morning did seem to check out, and Prantey was also relatively sure he had not seen Paul Main again until 6 p.m. that evening when they met at another friend's house. It had been Paul Main who announced then that the girl next door had been killed, and that was the first Prantey had heard about it. So the investigators all agreed that Paul Main deserved another look. And in the meantime, photos from Karla's murder scene were printed and sent to Dr. Campbell. Some were close-ups of the wounds to Karla's face, showing the injuries from different perspectives. Others were of the area surrounding her body. Each photo was placed on a table lighted from below, and a video camera above it relayed the image into the computer. It interpreted the image by measuring the density of the shading of the various surfaces in the picture, and that information was used to create a more detailed three-dimensional image on another computer screen. So then Bush was surprised on August 26th when Dr. Campbell called him. He wanted more photos of the TV trays that were at the scene. The wheels on the bottom of the stand could have made those strangely parallel, slightly curved cuts, spaced inches apart, on Karla's forehead and chin. So that had not occurred to Bush.
Yeah, bombshell.
Yeah.
So Bush kicked himself for not keeping the TV trays as evidence. Campbell's next question stunned him. What about the bite marks? Did you guys have any suspects in the bite marks on her neck? He asked. Bush didn't know anything about any bite marks, but Campbell told him that there were definitely bite marks. The photos weren't great, but they could be identified as bite marks. Campbell said, "You give me a suspect, and I think I can make a good comparison with the teeth." Then a similar call to the Wood River Police from Campbell sent Chief Goris running down the hall yelling for Don Greer. "She was bit, she was bit. Karla Brown was bit." Greer had an idea how important bite mark evidence could be from reading a book on the case of Ted Bundy. In that instance, bite marks on girls' buttocks had played a major role in the trial and convictions of Bundy.
Right. So Chief Gorris decided to fly out to Albuquerque with the TV trays and stand as soon as he could get them. He had to call Mark Fair to ask about them without revealing too much about these new developments. Mark was surprised by the chief's request for the trays. It had been so long since Mark had heard anything new that he'd almost given up hope. But he still had the trays and the stand packed away, and he delivered them to Gorris's home. When Gorris delivered the TV trays and stand, Dr. Campbell studied and measured the wheels and the bottom of the stand. Amazingly, he discovered a blonde hair and traces of dried blood still present on one wheel. So that doesn't look good for investigators, that was just left, right? Not great. I know they didn't have DNA back then, but still, might be something they should have found.
Well, yeah, they might have missed a few things.
I think so. So with that evidence and analysis, Campbell had no doubt the stand was the weapon that caused the cuts on Karla Brown's forehead and chin. Campbell showed Gorris at least 2 bite marks on the right side of Karla's neck and collarbone. The marks were clear enough in the photo Campbell enhanced with the computer that he believed they could be linked scientifically to the teeth of the person who had inflicted them. One of the bites in particular would be useful because it had not overlapped with the other marks. All he needed for a comparison was a mold of a suspect's teeth. So with their renewed suspicion of Paul Main, Gorris and the DCI agents agreed that the next step was to get a cast of Paul Main's teeth. So Greer arranged for a local dentist to make the dental impression, and on September 30th, the police contacted Main and explained that they would like to talk to him about the Karla Brown case. Main seemed confident as the dentist filled his mouth with the mixture to make a cast of his teeth, and the next day they sent the cast by FedEx to Dr. Campbell, but Main's teeth didn't match. And after that, the case went cold until March of 1982. And at that point, police investigators decided to exhume Karla's body and do a second autopsy.
Now, what were they expecting to find?
This was mainly part of a media campaign to get attention back on the case.
Okay.
Police told reporters about the exhumation and the bite marks on Karla's collarbone. They also had a profiler who said that this would get the suspect talking if they did this. They also indicated to the public that an arrest was inevitable. So Karla's body was exhumed on June 1st, 1982. The new findings confirmed what was found in the first autopsy, basically. They did examine the wounds on the collarbone and identified them now as bite marks, and the medical examiner would later testify that the injuries had occurred at or near the time of her death. Then after the autopsy and publicity, 4 friends of John Prantey went to the police with information about Prantey sharing knowledge that only Karla's killer would have known.
And so they've eliminated, or pretty much eliminated, the other
Paul Main
people. Well, not just Main, but
Mark,
Garza,
Paul Main,
and
pretty much. I don't think Garza and Myers were totally in the clear.
Yeah.
But Mark definitely was,
but
and Paul Main was.
At this point, they're almost starting from scratch.
Pretty much, yeah. And now they're going to look at John Prantey, especially after they hear from these people.
Yeah.
Which is what they were hoping, is they'd shake things up and hear some things with that exhumation happening. A court order compelling Prantey to submit to dental impressions was then signed by a judge, and an eavesdrop order was prepared so one of Prantey's old friends could be wired and sent to talk to Prantey 2 more times. The forensic odontologist explained to investigators that it was unlikely he could make an exact match because the marks on Karla's neck weren't clear enough for that. But he was sure he could eliminate a suspect's teeth by the distinctive spacing.
So the detectives drove to Prantey's home to get the dental impressions. Prantey greeted them calmly at the door, and they downplayed the need for an impression of Prantey's teeth. They told them that they were just tying up loose ends and marking suspects off the list. So if you could just give us your dental impressions, we'll be all set.
Yep, we'll be on our way, no worries.
Prantey agreed to the procedure. He got into the backseat of their unmarked police car, and then a local dentist made the dental plates for the impression. After the 2 complete impressions of his upper and lower teeth were made, they drove Prantey back to his home. His impressions were interpreted as a match by the forensic odontologist. Based on the bite mark evidence and Pranti's own words to friends, he was arrested and eventually put on trial for Karla's murder.
So it seems pretty thin to me. Pretty thin basis
Really
for an
thin.
arrest, yeah. I'm a little surprised that they went ahead and arrested him on this. But at trial, Vicky White testified that within 3 days of Karla's murder, she and her husband Mark were at home with Spencer Bond and his wife Roxanne. And according to Vicky, Pranti came to the house and began talking about Karla. According to her, Pranti told them that Karla had been murdered in her basement, she was found in a curled up position, and she had teeth marks on her body. She said that he made a gesture as he told her this, putting his arm over his shoulder to indicate the area near the collarbone. She also said that Pranti had seemed nervous and that he told them he'd been at Karla's house on the day of the murder, but that Karla had been all right when he left.
Now that's new.
Yeah, it is, and you have to wonder why they waited this long to come forward with it. But Pranti also told them, she said, that he had to get his story straight and get out of town because the police were looking for him.
So Mark White testified that within a few days of the murder, he and Vicky were at Roxanne and Spencer Bond's house when Pranti came over. Pranti was nervous and acting strangely, Mark said, and he again brought up Karla's murder. This time, he said he was supposed to go back and see Karla later on the evening of her murder. He didn't say why. And then again, Pranti had made the gesture to his shoulder when mentioning the bite marks. Mark also testified that Pranti told the group he was going to be questioned by the police about her murder and was afraid that he was the last person to see her alive.
So if he did say that, that is suspicious. Then Spencer Bond testified that Pranti came to his house to discuss the murder a few days after it happened and said that he had to get his story straight so the police wouldn't be able to crack his alibi. Then he had told Spencer that Karla had been in a curled-up position, stuck in a pail of water down in the basement, and she had teeth marks on her shoulder where she had been bitten. This time, he also added that Karla had been tied up. So Spencer Bond had 2 conversations with Pranti while wearing a wire for investigators. And in these conversations, Pranti could be heard acknowledging that on the day of the murder, he was on Paul Maine's front porch from 10 to 11 a.m. until evening, and he had seen Karla puttering around. He said that he had spoken with her on her walkway, but did not go inside her house. And in these recorded conversations, Pranti said he didn't remember the bite marks, and he wasn't guilty of anything.
Harold Pollard, who had known Pranti for 11 years, also testified at his trial. Pollard said that on the day of the murder, Pranti came to his house around 6:30 or 7 in the evening. He seemed agitated and anxious, and asked Pollard if he had any tranquilizers that he could use. Pranti told Pollard that he had just come from Paul Maine's house, where he had been smoking pot and drinking beer, and that the girl next door had been murdered or killed. Pranti said that Karla's body was found curled up on the floor with the hands tied behind her back. When Pollard asked Pranti how he knew this, Pranti said he got a glimpse of the girl by looking over the policeman's shoulder at the crime scene inside the house.
See, that wouldn't make any sense.
None whatsoever. According to Pollard, Paul Maine came to his house sometime after Pranti arrived, and the two talked about the murder. Pollard also testified that a day or two earlier, Pranti had told him that Karla was a really nice-looking girl, and he wouldn't mind having relations with her.
Yeah, I bet he didn't word it like that.
Oh, please. You're right.
No. So Susan Lutz, who had previously had a sexual relationship with Pranti, also testified. Lutz stated that on a couple of occasions Pranti bit her on the neck during sex. She also said that Pranti once whispered in her ear after having sex that he had killed a woman. You might think that would be the last time she had sex with him, but guess not. When Lutz asked why he had killed the woman, Pranti told her he was mad but would offer no further explanation, stating that he could not talk about it because he would lose his freedom. The state had the testimony of 2 forensic dentists, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Lowell Levine. Campbell testified that bite mark analysis had improved in recent years and had gained wide acceptance among pathologists. He explained that everybody's dentition is individual and even compared dental impressions to fingerprints. He also said that human skin was a very excellent medium for bite marks and an excellent reproducer of tooth characteristics. Dr. Campbell testified that the autopsy photos of Karla definitely showed at least 3 human bite marks on her right collarbone. Campbell compared the bite marks in the photos to the dental impressions of John Pranty, Paul Main, and 2 other men, and according to Dr. Campbell, Pranty's teeth were consistent with the bite marks, meaning that his teeth could have made the bite marks. It does seem very weak. He's just saying the teeth of the other man couldn't, but his could.
Yeah, good.
I don't think 3 men makes a scientific study. Dr. Campbell acknowledged that the original autopsy photos were in black and white and were unscaled. Still, Campbell said that there was nothing about the quality of the photos or the process by which they were taken that altered his opinion that the bite marks were consistent with Pranty's teeth. And like Dr. Campbell, Dr. Levine compared bite mark analysis to fingerprint analysis, stating that bite mark analysis really is no different than a fingerprint left by a bloody handprint on a wall, and that different persons cannot leave identical bite marks. Levine testified that there were bite marks shown in the autopsy photos, and he said that Pranty's teeth could have caused that injury pattern, and that if only the teeth of Paul Main and Pranty were considered, he would have to say that the bite marks had to be left by Mr. Pranty. Well, sure, but that's not really how you're supposed to do things.
No.
Crazy, really.
Doesn't seem real scientific.
No, but it gets worse.
Well, yeah, but remember, there's a lot of innovations that turn out not to be real.
Exactly. And that's the whole point of this story, really, is what's real science and what is just an interpretation that you shouldn't really rely on.
Yeah, well, you got to keep doing those experiments over and over and see how reproducible the results are.
Yes, but that wasn't done. And to me it's shocking because the state also called Pranty's own dentist, just a regular dentist, Dr. Ronald Mullen, to testify. And Mullen said he saw 6,000 to 7,000 patients a year and that the spacing in Pranty's teeth was very unique, so much so that less than 1% of his patients had teeth like that. So that's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, there's also, if you're saying that less than 1% of his patients had teeth like that, it tells you that there are people that have teeth with that arrangement.
Yeah, you could say that too, yeah. So what about the defense? I mean, what did they have to contradict this or anything?
Well, they had a Dr. Edward Pavlik, who was also a forensic odontologist, and he testified for the defense. Pavlik stated that there were several problems with the autopsy photos that purportedly showed bite marks. And the photos were not taken at the correct angle. There was no scale present for the purposes of comparison, and the pathologist appeared to be pulling on the skin in one photo, causing distortion.
Well, and remember, the photographer wasn't the professional photographer either. It was his hobby.
And Dr. Pavlik also said that injury in the photos was a bite mark. Dr. Pavlik said that the photos were one step above useless. When asked to assume that the injury in the photos was a bite mark, Dr. Pavlik said that Pranty's teeth were consistent with the marks, but that as much as 10% of the adult population had spacing of their teeth similar to his. So 1% from the one odontologist to 10% by the other.
Yeah, I'm really not buying the bite mark evidence. So, Pranty did testify in his own defense, and he said he had virtually no memory of the day of the murder, but that his memory had improved over the last year. So I'm sure that went over well with the jury. He said this happened when he started reading the discovery in the case and things started clicking back into place. Pranty stated that on the day of the murder he went to Paul Main's house around 8 or 8:30 a.m., then left to drop off some job applications. Then he returned to Main's house sometime between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. and then sat around on the front porch and probably got high again. When asked how long he stayed on the porch, Pranty said, "I keep having this feeling that I was there all day, that I stayed the entire day, that it just keeps coming to my mind."
He's not helping himself, is he?
No. He also stated that he may have left the porch at one point to see the house that Paul Main was painting, and that he may have gone away to the store. Just couldn't remember.
Yeah, well, he had a good buzz.
He was high a lot, and I don't think his intelligence was great. I really don't think putting him on the stand was the best decision. Pranty also acknowledged seeing Karla Brown on the day of the murder. According to him, she was out in the front yard puttering around, sometime in the morning or early afternoon, and was wearing white shorts and a white flowered top. Pranty testified that he remembered being on the front porch when police arrived after the murder and then going inside Paul Main's house with him. He said that he left Main's house in the early evening and then went to Pollard's house. He said that he first learned about Karla's murder when Paul Main told him about it at Pollard's house. Now, Pranty acknowledged that when he was first interviewed by Chief Skinner, he told him that on the day of the murder he did not return to Paul Main's house after dropping off job applications. And Pranty explained that he must have made this statement due to a memory problem or confusion. Pranty denied making the statements attributed to him by Pollard, Spencer Bond, and Mark and Vicky White. And he denied ever biting his ex-girlfriend, Susan Lutz. He also denied killing Karla. But, his memory was poor and he just did not make a good witness.
Yeah, he probably got chewed up on cross-examination.
Can you imagine? He must have been just a delight for the prosecutor to cross-examine.
So Pranty was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 75 years in prison. But he maintained his innocence and has made several attempts to appeal the sentence. In his 1986 appeal, the court rejected Pranty's claim that the state's expert testimony concerning the bite marks should not have been admitted. Then in 2017, Pranty filed a motion for DNA and fingerprint testing to be done. He wanted testing of several items of physical evidence, as well as analysis of a fingerprint found on the coffee pot in the basement rafters. The testing was allowed, but no interpretable DNA profiles were obtained, and there's no match for the fingerprint.
Yeah, so that was probably the only thing that would have saved him, is if they'd found the DNA of another suspect.
Yes.
But that was 2017. He'd already been in prison a very long time. And then in 2018, 35 years after he was convicted, Pranty filed a motion which raised 5 claims. 1, a claim of actual innocence. 2, a separate due process claim alleging that his trial proceedings were rendered fundamentally unfair by the admission of bite mark analysis evidence. 3, ineffective assistance of trial counsel. 4, ineffective assistance of appellate counsel. And 5, cumulative error. Pranty attached 2 affidavits to his petition from a Dr. Ian Priddy, an expert in forensic odontology. In these affidavits, Dr. Priddy said that at the time of Pranty's trial, the use of bite mark evidence was a well-accepted forensic technique, generally understood by its practitioners and by the scientific community to be valid and reliable. But since the time of Pranty's trial, that understanding had shifted significantly as a result of new research and scientific review. In light of this new research, Dr. Priddy said there's no evidence to support the fact that forensic dentists can even agree on what a bite mark is, never mind the more advanced proposal that this pattern may actually be linked to a person. So according to Dr. Priddy, even board-certified forensic dentists cannot reliably answer the threshold inquiry into bite mark analysis, and that's whether the injury at issue is or is not a bite mark. Dr. Priddy stated that the conclusions drawn by the forensic dentists in Pranty's case, even at the level of identifying the injuries as human bite marks, would not be supported by the scientific community in 2018. 3 scientific reports referenced by Dr. Priddy concluded that bite mark analysis has not been scientifically established, and human bite marks have not been proven to be unique, or that human skin can record these marks with any accuracy. So I'm no lawyer, but for some reason involving precedents, the bite mark evidence was not a constitutional violation and was not a due process claim. So Pranty's conviction was affirmed.
Now, John Pranty was released on parole December 2019. At the time of his sentence, the truth in sentencing law was not in effect, so Pranty was allowed a day off his sentence for every good day he served. He has maintained his innocence. He's had an incident of DUI in 2022 after crashing his vehicle, where no one was hurt. But otherwise, he's stayed under the radar.
Yeah, apparently. So today, we know that bite mark evidence has led to at least 25 wrongful arrests and convictions. 2 men who were sentenced to death based on bite mark evidence were exonerated by DNA testing. Multiple scientific studies have shown that bite mark analysts can't even agree on whether marks on human skin were made by human teeth or made by any teeth at all, really.
In 2016, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology concluded that forensic bite mark evidence is not scientifically valid and is unlikely ever to be validated. The report reviews some common forensic practices, so-called pattern matching practices, such as bite mark analysis, fingerprint and firearm analysis, shoe tread analysis, and DNA mixture analysis, each of which involves an expert looking at a piece of evidence and deciding whether it matches a particular image, person, or object. The report discusses whether each practice has been scientifically validated, what it would take to do so, and how each practice should be used in the courtroom, if at all used.
Right, so in the case of bite mark evidence, the report was especially critical. The council found that bite mark analysis does not meet the scientific standards for foundational validity and is far from meeting such standards, actually. In fact, available scientific evidence strongly suggests that examiners cannot consistently agree on whether an injury is a human bite mark and cannot identify the source of a bite mark with any accuracy. So nonetheless, bite mark analysis has been used in criminal cases to match individuals to alleged bites since the 1950s. That's when Texas's highest criminal court cleared the way for its use. And in that case, it's interesting, a dentist claimed that a bite mark left in a piece of cheese found at the scene of a grocery burglary matched the teeth of a particular man, and that was used to convict him.
But bite mark analysis is not the only practice criticized by the council.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting.
This is fun.
These are things we're always looking at.
Fingerprint matching has only recently been put to rigorous testing, and 2 such studies produced high error rates. In one, an error rate of 1 in 18 was found, and the other 1 in 306. So the report recommends that jurors be informed of the studies and their results.
Well, yeah, because if I was on a jury, to me, you give me a fingerprint of someone, I'm going to believe you that that's that person's fingerprint. There'd be no question in my mind.
Yeah.
Based on what I hear as a layperson.
What if you're told that 1 in 20,
yeah.
It should be what, 5%?
Right.
Might be an error.
That's pretty shocking, really.
It is. So used to like the DNA testing, it says that there's a chance of 1 in 20 billion that it's someone else's DNA.
Right.
That's pretty good.
That is pretty good.
But if I tell you that 1 in 5 is the chance.
Not so good.
Not so hot.
No. Well, even 1 in 300 is not enough to put someone to death or put them in jail for life.
No.
So where firearm analysis is concerned, the council notes earlier studies indicate that examiners can, under some circumstances, connect spent ammunition to the gun from which it was fired, but also reports that just one appropriate study has so far been conducted, so it really hasn't been studied much at all.
No.
And how many cases do we listen or read about where they say, yep, the casing matched the gun, and we say, okay, put him in prison. Happens all the time. If you watch true crime shows, you hear it all the time.
Yeah. And you hear the opposite, that the firing marks didn't match.
Right.
So that couldn't have been.
Same thing. You're right. It goes both ways.
So and with footwear analysis, and that's matching a shoe tread pattern left at a crime scene to a particular shoe based on randomly acquired characteristics such as cuts and gouges on the soles of the shoe, counsel found that there are no studies that demonstrate the practice is based on actual science.
That's another one I've seen in many cases. Interesting. So back in 2009, the National Academy of Sciences published a report on the state of forensic science in the courtroom. The report was highly critical of a wide range of forensic specialties, from fingerprints to hair and fiber analysis to blood spatter analysis. It found that many of the claims forensic analysts have been making in courtrooms for decades lack any scientific foundation to back them up. But still, judges and juries have taken and continue to take those claims as foolproof science, often because the experts themselves frame them that way. And they really do.
Yeah.
It's scary. So this is disturbing. We, as much as any other true crime show or discussion forum, have looked at many of these forensic opinions as proof of a suspect's guilt. Kind of makes you rethink things.
Absolutely.
But so far, every time someone has challenged the science of bite mark matching in court since 2009, the court has ruled against the challenger. The scientific community has declared that bite mark matching isn't based on reliable scientific methodology and has no scientific foundation, and that until and unless further testing indicates otherwise, it shouldn't be used in the courtroom. But despite this, the criminal justice system just basically says it doesn't care. It's just ignoring that, which is remarkable to me. So we'll have to watch how this goes over the years because things do have to change with this. I'm not saying it isn't something to be used in the courtroom, but it definitely needs to be scientifically proven before we're taking away people's freedoms or even their lives based on it.
That's right.
It's pretty scary. Plus, like you pointed out, we could be eliminating suspects who shouldn't be eliminated based on this.
Yep.
So it's pretty shocking when I researched this. I was surprised by this.
I bet you were.
I was. I knew that bite mark and hair analysis was pretty shady and being looked at. But anything where an expert has to make an interpretation is a little iffy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen it time and again. You have expert witnesses that will say whatever the prosecution or the defense wants them to say.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and that even was with the psychiatrists in that recent case we did with Alana Steinberg, where there were these psychiatrists giving their opinions based on really nothing, just shredding this victim apart.
It's based on what you believe in.
It really is. And it kind of is based on who does the jury believe, who can give the best performance for the jury, who does the jury like even.
Yeah.
Yeah. Scary stuff.
It is.
It really is.
Stay tuned.
Yes.
It's time for listener feedback.
All right, let's do some feedback.
Okay, I only did a voicemail that's got a couple case suggestions just because I thought that this was a fairly long episode.
It is a long episode.
And that our listeners were beginning to fall off. So I figured, well, let's do this. Let's finish this up. Keep their attention for 5 more minutes.
I think so. Although I think some people probably take a break and come back if it's a 2-hour episode, but
I could.
Me as a podcast listener, the longer the better for the podcasts I listen to. That's how I feel. So who is this from?
This is a voicemail from Georgia Ann with 2 case suggestions.
All right, let's hear what Georgia Ann had to say.
Hi there. I love your podcast, and here are 2 suggestions. The Murder of Billy Woodward by his wife, Anne, which figured very heavily in Truman Capote's literature and is now getting a little bit of a revival with the series on Hulu about Capote's swans. So that's always an interesting case. Also, the murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer, reportedly girlfriend of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I don't see a lot on either one of them, and both are very interesting. Anyway, thanks a lot. Love you guys. Speak with you soon.
Thank you, Georgia Ann. So Dick has been talking to me about that first recommendation, Billy Woodward. Tell us a little bit about that, Dick.
Well, I got interested in this because I was looking around for something to watch on TV, and I saw the miniseries of Capote versus the Swans, and that got me interested. Billy Woodward was a guy who was born into wealth, and he married Ann Powell in March of 1943. They had a pretty turbulent marriage. Infidelity on both sides, a lot of alcohol intake, just not a happy marriage. In October of 1955, the Woodwards attended a party. When they got home, they each took a shotgun to their respective bedrooms. They didn't sleep together, obviously. So they each had a bedroom. They each took a shotgun to their bedroom because there had been reports of a prowler in their neighborhood.
Sure, as you do.
Now, sometime during the night, Anne heard noises in the hallway, went out with a shotgun, and shot and killed what she thought was an intruder. But it turned out to be her husband, Billy. Now, no charges were ever filed against Anne, but she was banished from New York society.
And that was basically Truman Capote's fault, at least from the show, it looks like.
Well, she was banished. It was before Capote wrote about it.
Oh, I thought when he wrote the thing, then everybody was really against her, and then she killed herself.
No, she was ostracized because this was not fitting behavior.
Oh, okay.
Now, Capote had written a novel, or was writing a novel called Answered Prayers, and it had a character loosely based on Anne. And in the book, the Anne character murdered her husband because she had never divorced from her first husband.
Huh.
And then married her second husband because he was going to divorce her.
See, kids, money don't buy happiness.
No.
No, it doesn't.
That was an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely. I think I did see a book on Amazon about it, which I thought we should read because we can't base a show on a Hulu show, even though it's entertaining. We need to get the real facts.
Yeah.
Okay. And what was the second recommendation?
Well, this is about a purported girlfriend of President Kennedy. Mary Pinchot Meyer was an upper-middle-class painter and was supposed to be romantically involved with President Kennedy. In October 1964, she was shot and killed while walking on a footpath in Georgetown. A suspect was arrested, tried, and then acquitted for the murder. So it's still unsolved. Starting in 1976, there had been extensive investigations into the personal life of Meyer and her relationship with Kennedy. And it was confirmed by these investigations that she did have an intimate relationship with Kennedy from 1962 until his death in 1963.
Isn't that funny? We haven't heard of her. You'd think that would be something everyone has heard about.
I know.
Right?
We will have to delve into it a little more.
Let's delve. Sounds good.
Okay.
All right. So that's some good feedback. If you have left a voicemail or sent us an email, don't worry. We will get to it. We just felt we only had room for this week. And also remember, we do have a premium option of TCB, which gives you early ad-free and bonus shows. We also send new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you note. And you can subscribe by going to tygrabber.com/subscribe and get all your TCB episodes early and ad-free. Now, one super helpful and absolutely free way to support our show is to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts by scrolling down on our show page, selecting a star rating, and then tapping on Write a Review. We read all of the reviews and definitely appreciate them. If you do have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com, and voicemails, as always, can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Got plenty of seats.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.